Jim, who doesn't need much of an introduction because he has been speaking all over the Cape this summer. He is really, as far as I know, the local expert on windmills in particular. He was a consultant to the Chatham project when they restored their windmill this summer. And he has been involved in at least 2 that I know of, restorations of the windmill here in Easton, probably more. So I'm going to turn you over to the expert.
Now, if I can remember how this works. This is a representation, the first actual drawing or image of a windmill ever known to have existed was on a church document called the Windmill Psalter in the 10th or 11th century. And this is what they call the post mill. The earliest mills were built like this on a central post. They turned the whole building around and turned it out of the wind. The first windmill in Boston was a post mill like this one. And of course they were common in nursery rhymes and children's literature because they were so common everywhere in Northern Europe. This is a home grinding process, what they call a quern, in the Scottish Highlands somewhere. This is the way it was done before mills. And this is a saddle quern. The stone in front of the woman is concave, and you have a stone roller to roll back and forth. And that was done by a lot of the American Indians in the Southwest and Mexico used those. And this is another form of a quern. They're very common. This was in an outdoor museum in Hungary that I visited. And this is a fellow in Kathmandu who was making small stones for people in the mountains of Nepal who still grind their flour by hand because they don't have access to mills very readily. The mountains there are pretty remote. This is Manhattan during the Dutch days. If you look down in the lower right-hand side where the ship is, you'll notice there's a windmill next to the fort. That windmill stood right where the World Trade Center was before it was knocked down. And that's the same view again at a later time. And the North River is actually the mouth of the Hudson River. For some reason it's called the North River as well. And there it is again. This is Boston, and the curious thing there is that if you look at the north end, looking north toward Charlestown, do you see a pond that's closed in? Well, the dam on that pond is Causeway Street in Boston. When they filled the dam site in on both sides, they kept it as a right-of-way because it was being used that way. And there were 3 tide mills on that, grist mill, a sawmill, and a chocolate mill. When they were redoing the big dig, they discovered millstones from one of those mills. But there were 3 windmills in Boston at the time, one in Copp's Hill, which is that funny-looking chunk on the upper right-hand side of Boston, was called Boston Neck. Well, the whole thing was, but that's the north end. Copp's Hill is on the top end of the north end, and there was a windmill there. There was one where South Station is, and there was one along Boston, on Boston Common. That's the station that was, that's the site of South Station in Boston. That's probably used to be called Windmill Point. And after the Revolutionary War, Massachusetts required all the cities and towns to do a map of the main features of the towns. And this is Eastham. And of course, at the time, it was Orleans was also part of Eastham. And you'll notice the windmills in it. A windmill in the one of those sites of one of those mills was recently discovered by some children from the charter school when they were hunting for old town markers. Sparrow Hill rather, off Route 28 in the Water District in Orleans. There's a ring of stones there, and it's the site of a windmill. Those were the foundation stones of the mill. And they, because it was on top of a hill, it was never plowed. The Sparrow family knew it was there all along, but nobody else did because they never bothered to mention it. Nobody thought it was worth mentioning. This is an early view of the East End Mill when the front half of the green was covered with buildings. And that's a view of it from the town hall. And in 1955, they voted to buy the front end of the green and clear it off. The building on the right was moved down onto Mill Road, the rest of them were torn down. This is the way we turn the mill in and out of the wind with the horse. Actually, when we do it, we hook a truck up to it or get 5 robust adults to do it for us.
So that windmill was built there? That windmill was built here?
No.
No,
It was built in Plymouth.
Yeah.
The millwright who built it was the town clerk in East Ham, a man named Thomas Payne, but not the one that springs to mind.
And was it originally there?
No, it was
No.
in Plymouth, and then it was in Truro, and then it was
Yeah.
on a hill where the visitor center is now for the Seashore Park. This is the last time I ground some cornmeal in it some years ago. This is an iron gear that's in the mill. It's one of the most unusual items in the mill. The shape is, these were common in windmills in the late 17 and early 1800s and disappeared from use. And the only place you can find this gear now is on 3 or 4 of the mills on Cape Cod and nowhere else in the world. The shape was designed by a mathematician named Camus in 1750 and a guy named Murdoch who worked for James Watts, the steam inventor, started manufacturing. And so it's an unusual item to find. This is not a good photograph, but it was all I had. Edward Rose Snow on the left was a New England historian. Had a story from family in Pembroke about an ancestor who was cutting a millstone from a boulder. He was going to build a mill, and he got caught in the King Philip War and killed while he was working. And the family had the legend about it, so he and a descendant of that guy went looking in the woods in Marlborough, Mass, and found the original stone partially cut. He was caught there by the Indians during the war and killed. This is Route 6. The building on the left is the Swift Daily House. The building on the right is the Grist Mill Gallery. And if you look very close at the end of the road, you can get it. This is a blow-up of a larger photograph. You can see the windmill. Can you pick it out?
Yep.
And here in about 1915. I can date it to some extent because the town hall was dedicated in 1913. A lot of the fellows who worked in the mill or came and hung around had been to see it one time or another. So several of the mills on the Cape have drawings of various sailing vessels on the walls. And that's where the cat used to live. So we refer to that sometimes as a cat house. And it's the cat. And the hoist for the stones, I'll go through these fairly quickly. We had the stones recut, sharpened a few years back, and so we photographed everything. Unfortunately, the guy who did it was an authority known all over the world for his knowledge of mills. He was a friend of mine, and he has since passed away. Some of his tools and some more. Millstones do wear out, and they wind up in odd places like front steps or as grave markers. There's 2 of these in the Truro Cemetery, and there's one in the cemetery in Wellesley. Or they just get left over as decorations. Hanging the sails. In 1980, we celebrated the mill's 300th birthday. We put a new weather vane on it that John Hilferty carved, our former fire chief. 3 days after it went up, somebody stole it.
Oh, no.
And last year, a guy walked into the mill and handed it back to me. So I'm in the process of painting it so we can hang it back up again. Some of the work done on the mills, repairing the arms, taking out an old steel shaft that really shouldn't have been there in the first place because the wooden pieces that were on it were rotting away because of condensation. The new shaft arriving in Brewster where it was made, Andy Schrake, who did it, has worked on more windmills in the United States than any other person I know of. At least 9 windmills that I know of.
Did you want the Bass River?
Yep. He's worked on all of them. And the only one in the Cape he hasn't worked on is the East Mill at Heritage Plantations in Sandwich. There's a new shaft we put in 2 years ago, and putting it back up when it was finished. They put the sails on and then hoisted it up and slipped it in place. This John Fulcher, he had apprenticed in the mill as a boy, and when the town opened the mill to the general public in 1936, they hired him to do what I do now. And that's Bob Whiting, who did some work on the mill years ago. He also used to run a hot dog stand at Nauset Lake Beach called Bob's Doghouse. And Freeman Hatch, I replaced him when he got too ill to work. Some more of the guys that worked on the mill. Clyde Eagles on the left, me on the right before my beard changed color. Clyde Eagles and I. Dave Eagles, another guy who worked at the mill. This is a view of Jonathan Young Mill in Orleans from one of H.K. Cummings' photographs, when it stood right about where Emack and Bolio's is now. And that's the same mill again. This is Jonathan Young Mill was purchased by a sea captain named Hunt. They'd taken on a barge all the way down to Hyannisport. And when they broke up the estate some 20 odd years ago, they gave it back to the town of Orleans. And it's examining it to make sure the machinery was all there and taking it apart. Bill Quinn was behind it, and the guy who did the dismantling and moving was his brother Warren, and the guy operating the crane was my half-brother Everett Howes. So it was a family operation. And putting it back together again. And then the machinery inside. The bell in the hopper is called that because in order to keep the grain flowing, it's rigged so it jiggles up against the pinion shaft, the vertical shaft inside, and it literally hops all day long. So what they used to do, with most mills, have the millstones on the second floor, and the miller would be on the ground floor dishing out flour to people and dealing with customers. And when the grain got below the level of the bell in the hopper, it would ring and he'd run upstairs and add more grain. Meal bin that's been gnawed by mice. That's the Orleans mill in a finished state. This mill is in East Orleans. This is an odd mill. Hopkins Mill was in Orleans. It was moved to Brewster and then moved back to Orleans again. It overlooks Pleasant Bay in East Orleans. But it's unusual in that it is a post mill, but the post was buried in the ground and the building almost sat on the ground. And they turned the whole building in and out of the wind. Now it's got a fixed foundation because it's being used as a cottage. It had an iron shaft in it, which is still there, and the large gear wheel in it is also iron. This is the East Mill in Orleans that's now at Heritage Plantations. That's it again. That's it at Heritage. And this is Aries Mill that was on top of the hill in East Orleans where the cemetery is. And that's it again. And this is how I can identify it because it was moved to Consolment and it's part of somebody's house now. And it was a tea house at one time. And that's it today. But it has no machinery in it or anything. It's just part of somebody's house. Just a fun thing to have. This is a mill on Ellis Landing Road in Brewster. And the people that owned the property decided it was too much of an attractive hazard, so they gave it to the historical committee, and they moved it down Route 6A. And they moved it, they went by the elementary school, let all the kids out to watch it go by, and that's when the elementary school was in what is now the Brewster Town Hall. This mill is in South Dartmouth. It was moved from Rhode Island. Rhode Island mills had that characteristic round top to them quite often. And it belonged to Colonel Green, who was the son of a woman named Hetty Green. She was called the Witch of Wall Street. She was a financier and mean as could be. And when he was a lad, he broke his leg and she wouldn't get him medical help, so he had to limp all of his life. But when she died, he had a lot of fun spending the money. He had the first privately owned radio station in New England. He had a blimp, he had an airport and planes, and he owned the Charles W. Morgan, the whaling ship, and he had a windmill. And the house was always full of pretty young girls. And I shouldn't say this, but after his passing, when they went through his library, they found a huge hush pornography. And this is just for interest's sake. Even in Europe, they have to occasionally move mills, and a friend of mine sent me this. It's a German mill being moved to a new location because they built too many tall buildings around it and couldn't run it anymore. And to prove it's been done before, this is from an English painting from the 1700s, moving a mill across the countryside in England. This is the Brewster Mill getting some repair work done, putting a new shaft in, all finished. This mill was at Highland Light. You can see that in the background. It was used as an observation tower in its last days. This is a stereopticon slide in the same place with a picnic crowd gathered around. And the building in the foreground is the Double Dragon Restaurant. And you're looking across Town Cove, and that bare naked ground on the other side is Tonset. And there you can see a salt works. You see it? This is the salt works at Bass River. And the Judah Baker Mill at the time was on the Dennis side of Bass River. And this is another salt works, operated a little differently. And this is the Judah Baker when it was in private hands and underwent some restoration and repair work. These are some of the bits and parts. The true colors on the shingles are because somebody tried to set fire to it. They had to re-shingle it. This is the mill in Harwich at Winchmere Harbor, Nickerson Mill. That's in its heyday. This is later. It's still there, part of someone's house today, but I've never been inside it. This is the Chatham Mill when I was at Mill Pond. Again, it was on private property, and they gave it to the town because they were tired of people tramping across their lawn all the time. A curious little thing, when they built these, the framework was prefabricated. They cut all the pieces and they brought them to the site and assembled them. And they marked them with Roman numerals so they know which piece went where. And the trick question is, why did they use Roman numerals? Can anybody answer that? That's right. They are all straight lines. Because they never got up to 100. And this is in the Chatham Mill. Some years ago when they were working on it, they took the roof off, but the crane was overbalanced and dropped it, and they had to rebuild the entire cap.
Where was that mill in Chatham originally?
Well, overlooking Mill Pond in South Chatham. And there it is. Been restored twice because when they, first time they restored it 20 odd years ago, they just shut the door and never had it open. And it deteriorated to the point where Andy Schrag had to come back and redo it this last winter. This is a Ferris mill in Yarmouth. It was moved in different places in Yarmouth at least 5 times and eventually wound up in Greenfield Village, Dearborn, Michigan. A group of Ford dealers bought it and gave it to Henry Ford. This mill was in South Dennis. It was being used as a bathhouse for a while, and then it was burned down as a 4th of July celebration. And this one is also in Dennis, but it was just off Route 6 behind Warden Hall, which is an art gallery. But the guy who bought it was also a RISD graduate like I was. I knew him. He taught in the Dennis schools. And right after he bought it, before he moved into the property, because this was on his property, a couple of tramps who were cooking supper and burned it down. And this is in Wellfleet on Holbrook Avenue. It's part of a cottage called Morning Glory, but it was a windmill. I've been inside it, and I can guarantee that's what it originally was. And one of the millstones is the front step in that building. This is another Rhode Island mill in Kitsamit that had 2 pairs of millstones, and it's now a summer cottage. This one has disappeared from view from Falmouth. It had 6 arms on it one time. And this was also in Falmouth, but it was moved out to Wareham somewhere, and it eventually burned down. It was owned by an ice cream and dairy company. This is in Martha's Vineyard. This is the windmill in Nantucket. It sits on a ridge that had 4 windmills on it. There's only the one left. It was bought in the 1890s by a well-to-do summer resident and given to the Historical Society. There it is. Again. And this is an oddity. It was built in the early to middle 1800s in western Massachusetts near Montague by a Polish immigrant. It no longer exists. The only photograph I have of it came from a newspaper photograph. This one and this one were built down by Mass Maritime Academy in Buzzards Bay. 2 gentlemen's country estates, Joe Jefferson, the actor, and General Taylor, who owned one of the Boston newspapers. They were pals. And for years, Board insisted they were Dutch mills that had been brought here from the Netherlands, and they weren't. And they have finally decided that that's the case. This one is at Tuxet Trading Post on this side of the canal, and the other one's still where it was originally. The estates were wiped out in the 1938 hurricane, generally speaking. This is an imitation mill down in Harwich, south of Route 28. It was designed and built in the 30s by, early 30s by a Chatham architect named Buck. And it's another one near the Chatham Bars Inn. They claim it's a real windmill, but it isn't. It's too small. It was, I can't think of his name now, but a well-known author sequestered himself in there to do some writing years ago. And I wish I could remember his name right now. I can't think of it. And a lot of imitation ones all over the place. There's another one there. And this is in Rhode Island. Governor Arnold, who was an ancestor of Benedict Arnold, owned this mill. For years it was thought to be a Viking tower, but the general consensus now is that it was a windmill because Arnold had come from England, and this mill in England near Chesterton was where he came from, in that same area. This one was designed by Inigo Jones. Those are the only 2 I know of in the world that were built on that pattern. This is another Rhode Island mill. Boyd's Mill, which is in Middletown, Rhode Island now. This is one of the ones that Andy Schrake restored. It has 8 arms. There are only 2 left in the world with 8 arms. This one and one in northern England. That's Boyd's Mill before the restoration. And there it is, all done.
Wow.
That's on Jamestown, Rhode Island. This one is on Block Island. So are these. And this one. This is I've forgotten where this is, but it's from an old print. It's the outer end of Long Island. There are a number of mills out there. This is Hook Mill in East Hampton. And these are diagrams of the mill that were printed in the magazine. And that's the Pentago Mill, which is near the building, the home of John Howard Payne, who wrote Home Sweet Home. And this is another Long Island mill, and I forgot where it is.
That's Watermill.
And this one's at Bridgehampton. And the curious thing on the stern of the cap was used to drive a worm gear inside the cap, and it would turn it automatically into the wind whenever the wind shifted. This mill was built in Morristown, New York, upstate New York. But the miller died before he ever ran it, so it's just sitting there. Because it was built of stone, so it will sit there probably forever. And this mill down in the lower left-hand corner was in a little island in the river at Philadelphia. But the island was dredged out so that they could have better navigation in the river. This is Spokot Mill in Cambridge, Maryland. This is another Maryland or Delaware mill. This one had Greek-style sails on it, like this. Oh, Portuguese, these are Portuguese-style sails. They call them jib sails. This was a windmill at Yorktown. This is the Robertson's Mill at Williamsburg, Virginia. This is a reproduction, but it's a very good one. Another post mill at Flower 200. That mill has been moved now down to a museum, a mill museum in Texas. This is in Kansas. I've forgotten where this one is. This one is at Mount Emblem Cemetery outside of Chicago, Illinois. It was built in the early 1800s by a German immigrant. And this is another one at Batavia. There are several in that area built by German settlers in the early to middle 1800s. This was built by a Finnish immigrant in Wisconsin. And this is a 20th century postcard of it, so I suspect it's still there, but I don't really know. This is I've forgotten where this mill is. There's too many of them. These are all in the Midwest, these mills you're looking at. Some of them are old ones that have been restored. A couple of them are reproductions. This is a Danish mill in Elkhorn, Iowa, that from the early 1800s in Denmark. It was bought in 1975 and moved in pieces to Elkhorn, Iowa, and reassembled. The town's only about 1,000 people, almost entirely Danish descendants, and that's why they bought the mill. And it has one of those fantails for luffing the mill up on the roof. And they operate it fairly often, and it's been a big boon to the town because they get a lot of tourism as a result of it. This is one that was built by German immigrants in Texas. It's down near a place called Victoria in Texas. Very small, was built of chinked logs and then eventually shingled. This is Murphy's Mill. This is in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. There are two of these. They were designed to pump water from artesian wells. They could pump 40,000 gallons an hour. And they put them in an artificial lake and used the water to water Golden Gate Park. In 1902 or 3, when they did that, there was no public water system. And that one's been recently restored. This is an imitation windmill in somewhere near San Diego. And of course, mills like this are called all over the world. They're called American mills. But there are variations on them. This was used in a machine shop to run machinery. And there was one like it in New Orleans, not quite that big. French mills along the St. Lawrence River. That's another one. This is a sugar mill in St. Croix. They're all over the Caribbean. They were used to crush sugar cane by windmill. This one's in Barbados. And this is in Norfolk in East Anglia. Norfolk, like a lot of Netherlands, is below sea level. And so when it rains, you have to pump the rainwater out. Otherwise, it just sits there. That's another drainage mill in the same area. And here, to give you an idea of how people restore mills, this wreck became this. I visited that mill some years ago. This mill is in Boston. Does anybody recognize it? Boston in Lincolnshire. Right across the river from it is a jailhouse that was there in the 1600s. And I went in and sat in the jail cell that one of my ancestors sat in when he got arrested for trying to leave with the original Plymouth Company, Elder Brewster. So I got to sit in his jail cell. And this is another English mill, a big post mill. And this is the wreck of a French mill. And this is costumes worn by people in the 1600s who were millers. This is at a French mill. another, the French were the only ones who did this. They built these stone towers and put the post mill on top of it. And you had to climb up there to operate it. There's another one. And there are 3 of these right on the border between France and Belgium that were in the process of being restored when I visited the place. Now, Moulin Rouge is French for red mill, but on Montmartre, where Moulin Rouge exists as a nightclub, where it's 4 windmills, there are 3 of them there. And the French had a habit, if one of the mills killed its miller, they would refer to it as a red mill, Moulin Rouge. And one of those mills killed its miller. And that's where the name of the nightclub comes from. And I can guarantee you that at least 3/4 of the people in Paris don't know that. And there's the only one of them that's still left. That's in Montmartre. And this is another French mill out in the countryside. And this is a mill in Denmark that I visited. They had a donkey engine to run it when there was no wind, but whenever the wind was blowing, they shut the engine off because the wind is free. And the same one. And the stage that you see up above is called the winding stage. That's where they stood to turn the roof around. And there's the miller, the one on the right. There's another Belgian mill. And another one. Whenever they needed more stuff, they just added something onto the side of it, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger. This one is in Bruges. There are 3 windmills on the edge of the town of Bruges. If you're ever around there, it's a beautiful place. But go see the mill. I went in there and introduced myself, and the miller gave me the freedom of the place because they were grinding flour when I was there. The Kinderdijk in the Netherlands, those are all drainage mills. There are actually 30 of them there at one time. This is also in the Netherlands. Sometimes built them up high in order to get wind over the buildings, like this. And just some machinery, some more machinery. This is in Sweden. The Norwegians never built mills. They had so much usable water power, they never bothered. But the Swedes do. This is on Gotland. It's on a Swedish island in the Baltic. This one is in Ireland. And this was in one of the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain. I've forgotten which one. And this one is in Hungary. The lady in the foreground is Dutch. We were there on a conference, and she and her husband used to run a windmill, a drainage mill for the town they live in the Netherlands. This is another Hungarian mill. And there's the miller. He's a feisty little guy. And this is a Russian mill. And here's another Russian mill. These are in La Mancha, Spain, central Spain, where there's no rivers that you can use. They used a lot of windmills. And these are several of 14 mills on a ridge in the middle of Portugal. The Portuguese government was restoring all of them one at a time to make a tourist attraction out of them. That's a Portuguese mill. They put clay jars on the ends of the sails, and they whistle when they're turning. And when the wind changes speed, the sound changes. And the miller knew right away, because he could hear it, that the wind had shifted on him or changed. And these are, the Greeks use, these little triangular sails are called jib sails. The Greeks use lots of them. The Portuguese use just a few large ones. That's the essential difference. And this is a mill in Trapani in the southwest corner of Sicily. And all of the water that you see there are salt pans where they were evaporating seawater for salt. And that one was being used to pump water for it. And this one is in South Africa. This one is in Perth, Australia. This one is in Jerusalem. And this is just some people on a mill tour that I went on. Somebody turned a mill into a coffee house, and they're using a millstone for a table. And that's me and another mill enthusiast somewhere. Again, I'm visiting a mill in England, and the guy who was the miller, covered in flour dust, by the way. He and I had friends in common, so I got the freedom of the place. Go climb all over everything. And the same thing, this is outside of Gouda in the Netherlands. Same thing there. In fact, the mill wasn't even open when I was there, and Noah came over and introduced himself and opened the mill for me and ran it. And that's it.
Very good.
If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer.
Oh, why would they kill the miller?
No, the miller was killed by his machinery.
Oh, he was killed by the
As a matter of fact, there was a guy in what was then, it's Orleans today, but it was part of Eastham at the time. There was a man who was executed for murdering his wife in the windmill. She pushed her down a flight of stairs. Oddly enough, they had about 6 or 7 children, so there'd been some connubial bliss before that. Nobody knows, a guy named Harding. And that's what how he was, that was the history of that mill.
Are the blades open lattice because of weight?
Well, they're a framework to hold the canvas sail so that it doesn't billow all around.
What I mean is, I noticed that they would do it in open frame fashion on most of these.
Yeah.
And
Well, you're seeing them without the canvas on them.
and so they would be covered at some point. Yeah.
They also have came up with an invention of what I call shutter sails, which are like a Venetian blind. And they had a control inside, and when the wind got stronger, they could actually turn the control and it would shift the blade so they would spill some of the excess wind. And somebody else came up with an even more brilliant idea. They rigged up a spring mechanism on each arm. He didn't have to bother to do it because if the wind picked up speed, the wind pushed them open. And but those are sort of Johnny-come-latelys. It's one of the surprising things is the number of mechanical inventions that are used in all kinds of other machinery to do work that were developed originally in water mills and windmills so that they could convert the energy to do this job or that or the other. They ran sawmills and fulling mills, they ground gunpowder, they ground pigments for paint, they pumped water, and there were hammer mills that were used to pound metal into tools. Almost anything you could think of that a machine could do, they figured out a way to do it. There's a whole series of inventions that came along one right after the other. And today you find them in any kind of machinery that's actually doing physical work. And the gears, for instance, in our mill, the large gear wheel has 56 teeth. The small gears, if it were an even number, it would be 14 teeth. But it isn't, it's 13. And the choice was either to have 13 or 15, but not 14. And the reason is the odd gear is called a hunting cock. And what it did is it made the small gear work its way around the large gear every time it turned. So it didn't hit the same, the teeth didn't mesh the same way each time. And that came up in water mills and windmills in ancient times. And all of the gearing in your car is done the same way.
Who invented that? Or did, you know, who?
I don't know who did, nobody knows who did that.
Okay.
I mean, there are some things that you can point and say, this guy invented it.
Yeah.
The cast iron gear in our shaft was invented, the shape is odd, and it's called an epicycloidal curve. And it was designed by a French mathematician named Camus in the 1750s. The odd thing about that is that I did a presentation on mills in Germany some years ago to a bunch of real pros in this field. And I did it as a slide presentation because they were interested in what they looked like because they hadn't come here. And when I showed pictures of that gear, everybody got excited. They were in common use at one time and then disappeared. And nobody knew that one of them even still existed anywhere. And we've got 4 mills here on the Cape that still have that gear in it. When they restored the Brewster mill the first time around, they hired a so-called historical expert. And he made 2 serious mistakes. The first one was he had them put pine shingles on it because he said in the 1600s they used pine shingles, but that mill was built in the late 1700s and nobody was using pine shingles. And in 2 years after they did it, they had to rip them all down and replace them with cedar because the pine was rotting away. And the other thing he did was to have him take the iron gear out and put a lantern gear in, which is a wooden gear. I had some examples of that in the show, but I didn't bother to identify them. And they didn't realize how unusual it was. They still have it, and it's been reinstalled now. But I was over there one day on a sort of a busman's holiday and found the gear sitting on the floor, the ground floor, and next to it was the wooden pattern that it was cast from. And I mentioned it to the guy who was in there, who was a volunteer from the Historical Society. And he went and looked at what I was pointing out, and then he said, I didn't realize what that was. And of course, they're two identical shapes, because it's sand casting. And they used the wooden one to set the mold and take it out and then pour in the metal. And I'll give you one guess what that guy was doing before he retired to Cape Cod. He was a pattern maker with a company that made sand castings. Some people just don't see things when they look at them. Anything else I can tell?
Do you still do any international traveling?
I haven't lately. I belong to an organization that does a major symposium every 4 years. Come hell or high water, I'm going to go to the next one because I missed the last one.
Where will that be?
I don't know yet. I have been to Hungary, Germany, Belgium, Wales, and Portugal to go to those. But I missed the last two. And I don't have a good reason for doing it. I should have gone. But I'll go to the next one if they have to carry me. In fact, I've made a lot of friends because of it. There's tons of places. I was traveling through the Netherlands, and I went to go to, there's a working windmill in the middle of the town called the Red Lion. It has red sails on it. And when I walked inside, the miller pointed his finger at me and said, I know you. And he did too. We were both at the same conference, in the one in Germany where I did the slide presentation. And oddly enough, it was the only one he'd ever gone to. So he remembered. That's one of those neat little things. If you have an interest that's widespread, even if it's a very narrow one, like stamp collecting, if you've got a major collection, anybody who's got a good collection knows who you are, because they've probably been outbid by you to get something. And the same is true of other interests. People do model railroading, for instance. I've been in touch with, I belong to the Nauset Model Railroad Club. I'm not active in it, but I belong to it. And there's a guy in Trieste, Italy, who has a fantastic setup of model railroads, all American stuff, not European. And he's my age, and he's a commercial artist like I used to be. And I've been in touch with him over the years, because I spent 3 years in that neck of the woods at the end of World War II. And it's, like I said, it's a small world. What else? Anything at all?
I could keep going with questions, but I figured somebody else might want a chance to get one in.
Take a shot.
Well, I noticed that they're either were built of stone or wood, and I was wondering how one fared.
Well, it depends on where you are and what.
I'll tell you why, because I was in one windmill, it was in Nantucket, and they had it running
Yeah.
at the time, and the whole thing shakes.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, well, how could you build how could it be stone? You'd be fixing it every,
No,
no.
the stone ones, I've been in stone mills that were running, and you don't have a problem.
Reverberation of anything. Okay.
The reason they're built of stone in some places is because
That's what
there's a lot of deforestation in Northern Europe.
yeah.
And that one of the reasons was that they were more permanent. And they have a tendency to burn down. The flour dust is highly flammable.
Okay.
The next time, if you like to bake and you sift flour, don't ever do it near a gas stove. That's a no-no. I have a picture from an old newspaper account in Minneapolis. A flour mill, modern flour mill, early 20th century, exploded. Took up a whole city block and blew the whole thing to smithereens. Think about that. That's why they didn't work at night in the mill, because when a working mill, there's flour dust everywhere. Like the picture I showed you, the guy in the windmill. He was covered in it. Every nook and cranny had dust in it, everywhere you look. Some of them died of white lung. In Staffordshire, there were a number of water mills that went out of business because modern milling methods killed the business. So what they were doing to keep on working and feeding their families, so several of them started grinding animal bone for bone china, because that's a big area for producing china. And the average life expectancy for a miller grinding bone for the ceramics industry is 5 years. Try that.
We do have some cookies and lemonade if people would like to stay for a little while and talk with Jim or talk with each other.
I'm not in a hurry to go anywhere.
Thank you.
Great, great sharing. Piece of the old bathroom, the Drew Baker one.